At this time, we'll go ahead and open it up for public comment. I want you guys to know that you can also comment on or after regular agenda items as well. There's no public comment at this time. We will go ahead and move into the regular agenda. We'll go ahead and consider approving the May 21st Water Advisory Board regular minutes. Everybody have a chance to look at them? We have a motion to approve. Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Next item will be an update on the water supply projections. Allison?
Thank y'all. Good morning. I actually updated these numbers as of early this morning. My presentation was geared towards last week's numbers, but as y'all are all aware, Twin Buttes caught a considerable amount of water this weekend, and so I did update these as best as I could this morning. They're still very preliminary, and as we know, we still have some inflow coming into Twin Buttes. So Ivy didn't catch as much, but still caught a couple thousand acre feet. OC Fisher really remains about the same as it was last week, but Twin Buttes, we were only able to get the North Pool elevation and volume this morning. The South Pool is still due to weather conditions and stuff like that. So this 22,700 is just the North Pool volume. And then Lake Nasworthy, also a smaller body of water, caught a few acre feet, but not much there. Just to kind of go through our drought calculations, I do this with y'all every time, but that the IV projections are provided by CRMWD. So last council meeting, we actually, the council voted to come out of drought level 1, effective immediately, because Ivy had caught quite a bit of water in a few weeks prior to that. And so CRMWD had moved that projection from September 2019 to December 2019. So we put that into our calculations, and it did move us out to the 25 months of water supply. So we did come out of drought level 1. As always, this is a no inflow worst case scenario. And it's also based on bringing in the minimum production from the Hickory facility. And we also use 67 inches of evaporation each year from Texas Water Development Board. So these are the preliminary numbers that I quickly ran through this morning. So as I said, Ivy is projected to last through December 2019. OC Fisher really didn't change much, so it's still, by the time Ivy is offline, OC Fisher still provides about 3 months worth of water. And then the big winner, the one that pushes that 31 months, or that from 25 to 31 months, is the Twin Buttes calculation. And still, this is reflective of only the North Pool volume. So we are preliminary looking at 31 months of water supply as of this morning. Just standard water conservation restrictions are now in effect. So you can water twice every 7 days. Once November begins, that'll be once every 7 days. And then still no more than 1 inch per week, and not between the hours of noon to 6. So with that, that was my water supply update. It was quickly updated as of this morning. So,
Any questions?
Back to when you have in there OHIV and Hickory and OC Fisher and Hickory, how does that, the and Hickory part is what
that's that minimum pumping every day of 1.5 MGD is just what we factor in the calculation. Sometimes it's a higher number than that. Sometimes we have it offline due to weather or maintenance. But on average, we're bringing in the 1.5 million gallons per day, and so we adjust that with our average daily usage. So that's what that and Hickory means. So we are factoring Hickory in just at a minimum pumping.
Yeah,
yes.
That's right. Okay.
Anyone else?
I just might add, too, that I'm sure Allison knows the last time we had that volume in Twin Buttes was July of 2017. It was real close to the same amount. So I know in her calculations, she only added another 6 or 7 months, but understand that last time we had that was over a year ago. We had that same elevation volume.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.
We'll go ahead and move into item C on the regular agenda, water supply engineering feasibility study, an update on that.
Okay, so at the last board meeting, y'all were presented a part of this water supply engineering feasibility study. Today, we're just going to provide an update on where we are with the study. And Scott Hibbs gave the presentation last time, and he'll be the one presenting on this again. So I'll welcome Scott to come up here and give you all this presentation.
Thank you, Allison. Mr. Chairman, board member Scott Hibbs with EHT Engineering out of Abilene. Also with me is Ellen McDonald with Allen Plummer Associates out of Fort Worth. We have basically completed the study, and what I would like to present to the board today is the findings and kind of get you guys up to speed with how the study progressed and how it came out. So we'll go quickly through and remind the board of the evaluation process that we used. And if you remember the last time I was here before the board, we had narrowed it down to 4 options that we were going to do the detailed engineering on. So I'll provide what that analysis looked like. We do have a recommendation that we presented to City Council, and we have some next steps that the city is considering and some that they've already implemented in moving the project or the process forward. So just as a way of reminder, we started this task with the charge from the city staff and from the board and from the council to cast a wide net to make sure that you look at any feasible water supply option for the city and take those into account. So we started with 24. Which is a pretty good sized universe of options to look like. It was a mix of groundwater options, purchased water options, for example, purchasing water from the Colorado River Municipal Water District, a number of reuse options, how do we make use of the wastewater that is available to the city, and then several that we called other options, which would have been brush control, subordination, those types of concepts. After the fatal flaw analysis, those 24 were whittled down to 10. Fatal flaws, when we looked at that, just to remind the board, those were things, for example, if a supply did not yield water during times of drought, that was a fatal flaw. So we eliminated several of the options, 14 of the options, due to those types of criteria. Then we went into another scoring round with city staff and worked very hard to take those 10 options that remained down to the 4 that were presented to the board last time I was here and that were formally evaluated. So the 4 that made it to the short list that we talked about last time, one was the Edwards Trinity Plateau Aquifer. That was the sole remaining groundwater option that survived the fatal flaw and the initial screening. We looked then at using the wastewater as a resource with augmentation of Lake Nasworthy. That had been looked at in the past quite extensively. We revisited that option again, along with direct potable reuse. DPR, as it's kind of referred to, has also been looked at extensively in the past. We dusted that study off and brought it up to current numbers and a current evaluation. And then one that we did not anticipate when we first started the process that made it on the list of 24 and survived to the final round was augmenting the Concho River, using it as an environmental buffer to move wastewater downstream to a point where we could pick it back up as a part of the Concho River water and then bring that back into the city and treat it. So with each of those 4 options, I'll go through them quickly. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to stop. The remaining groundwater option was the Edwards Trinity Plateau, generally southwest of the city. Good aquifer, good quality of water. We were a little bit concerned when we finally got into the very detailed analysis of that supply about the quantity. It looked like from our studies, and of course we had a groundwater hydrogeologist on our team, WSP, their analysis revealed that we probably could only rely on about 4 million gallons a day from this particular source if it could be developed. In the end, that played significantly into the decision-making process, and I'll kind of show you that in a graph here. in a few minutes. So we did have a groundwater option that survived and went through the detailed evaluation. Good quality of water. The challenges are the quantity of water that it would survive. You guys probably remember the option of augmenting Nasworthy. This graph that you see before you and is up on the screens for the folks behind me to see. Basically, you would renovate the wastewater treatment plant to bring it into the ability to treat water to wastewater to a higher degree. We would continue to use the irrigation storage ponds, and then when times of drought occurred and you wanted to augment Nasworthy with water, you would send that water through an advanced treatment process and then discharge it into kind of the river that you see right there and let it then flow down the river into Nasworthy. The challenge with this option is not only that Nasworthy is not a very big bucket of water, but the water quality standards that we have to deal with this source requires that you would have to take that wastewater through reverse osmosis. So you lose a little bit of wastewater, you lose a little bit of your supply source that you're dealing with. And in this particular section of the river, you also are subject to fairly high evaporation rates. It's not a flowing river naturally. So that option had some challenges with reducing the amount of water that would be available, but it is a viable option. DPR, you guys are well aware of what that process entails. It is basically taking your wastewater, making it drinking water quality, moving it on to the water treatment plant, and then off to the distribution system without any other environmental buffer. And that's really the challenge with DPR, with augmentation of Nasworthy and with augmentation of the Concho River. You're providing a natural buffer. Mother Nature is doing some of the work for you. With DPR, you don't have that. The challenge with DPR, again, is the advanced treatment required would generally necessitate reverse osmosis, and adding that component then does impact the yield of that particular option. So the final option that we looked at, and ultimately the one that is recommended in the study, is augmenting the Concho River. Basically, the upgraded wastewater treatment plant would produce a high-quality effluent that would then be discharged into the Concho River. We'd let then Mother Nature do its work as it meanders down to the Concho River and actually build a intake on the river on city-owned property downstream, pick that water back up, move it into the water treatment plant, where we would add some treatment components at that location to make sure that the quality of the water meets state standards. So how do these stack up? I like this chart. This puts the four options that we looked at on top of the existing supplies that you have. These supplies are what are available to the city in times of drought. So we're going to assume that you've lost Nasworthy, you've lost some of the ability to use some other sources during the heart of a drought, and you're relying on the Hickory, you're relying on the water from Ivy, and a little bit of water that you've got in the South Concho River. But the bars on top of that are really the key. Those are the four options that we looked at. The heavy black bar is the estimate that we developed that we call kind of the lower boundary of the demand that the city might be looking at for the next 50 years, basically through 2070. The dashed black line on top is, in general, the Region F projection of the city's water needs through 2070. So we looked at Region F as kind of the upper limit. In talking with staff, your Region F uses a hot, dry year, and that's generally in our part of the world, 2011. That's how it sets its gallons per capita per day that it then uses to project demand. That hot, dry year is not really realistic long-term, day in and day out. So we worked with staff to get a more reasonable number on what citizens would use over the course of a 50-year period. And that's what sets that lower bar. So I really think we've got a good range between that lower demand and the upper demand to look at. As you can see, the option of the Edwards Trinity Plateau aquifer, while it does take us for a couple of decades, it quickly falls off. It just does not provide enough water to be the recommended solution for the city. The DPR and the Nasworthy options show a little bit less yield, as I discussed. We have to do advanced treatment with reverse osmosis, and there is an evaporation component with the Nasworthy option. The Concho River water supply, though, as you see, takes you into 2050, even using Region F's numbers. It takes you into 2060, and I would argue into 2070, using what we really anticipate the city's demands will be. So just putting that in kind of a tabular form so that you have all three or all four of these options in front of you, you see that the yield of the groundwater, as I mentioned, around 4 million gallons. The Concho River water supply option is nearly twice that, and that's the big kicker with it. Cost of the projects, obviously the groundwater is the least capital cost. But if you'll notice on the unit cost of water, it is the Concho River water supply is actually the least expensive option while you have debt service. And quite frankly, that's because it's a lot closer than going to the Edwards Trinity Plateau and extracting groundwater and moving it into town. And then once debt service drops off, it still remains a very attractive option compared to Nasworthy or DPR, and is really right on par with the cost of the groundwater. Again, the groundwater distance really hurts it. So we took those four options. Once we got the detailed work done, we sat with staff and had a significant time of discussion, time of evaluation, where we looked at the different subjective and objective decision factors that go into selecting a water supply. With staff's guidance and input, there was a matrix developed that you see before you that basically echoed what intuitively I think we knew going into this exercise, and that is that the Concho River water supply option was the preferred option to be followed by the city. You see how these fell out. DPR actually came out second in this ranking, with the Edwards Trinity Aquifer third, and the augmentation of Nasworthy as the fourth option. So the recommendation that we're moving forward to council is that you, as a city, start developing this Concho River water supply option as the lowest unit cost, also has the highest yield. And two other things that we visited with council that are very important with this option. Many of you know that the infrastructure at the wastewater plant and the water plant is aged. The wastewater plant has actually been upgraded fairly systematically over the years, but it's due for that to happen again. The water plant is much more challenged, and I think if you talk to Allison and staff, you know that they're dealing with 1950s and really earlier technology in a lot of those areas. So this option in the cost estimate actually has a treatment plant component for about 7.5 or 8 million gallons a day of the newer treatment technologies that then they can use as a stepping stone to expand the rest of the plant and also take that old infrastructure offline. The other benefit of it is that the components that we would be adding to the water plant would work just remarkably well for your other surface water sources. You would only be drawing on this source in times of drought and in times when you need that water. When Ivy has water, Ivy could be treated with this new technology, this new treatment plant. The water that you pull out of the South Concho River right now could be treated with this water plant. So it would have a component that the city could make use of on a day in and day out basis. Also provides a nice stepping stone to upgrade the remainder of the plant. So what does this option look like? This is just another graph just taking off the other three that were discarded and showing you how your supplies look with the low demand that I discussed and the high demand. And as I said, I get the picture shows us easily into 2060. I would argue 2070 looks pretty good, and it's it's anybody's guess when you're looking 50 years out anyway. But it does position the city extremely well to use its own resources, not be reliant on anybody else, and really resolve the challenge that you have right now, and that's Allison up here every quarter telling you how many months of water supply you have remaining. This would eliminate the need for that conversation on a quarterly basis. So what are the next steps? The council in their meeting on the 18th authorized that we start the permitting process. 2 permits are required to implement this strategy. One is a wastewater discharge permit, something that the city has never had. Currently operate with irrigation under what we call a land application permit. So there's a permit for the water reclamation facility that would be required. The second permit is a permit to allow the city to use the Concho River to transport that water to the intake where it would then be removed. And that's called a bed and banks permit. So those 2 permits are critical to the process, and since they are critical and they do take time, the council authorized that work begin immediately. We'll move on into doing some additional piloting with most of the newer water treatment technologies. Those are required by the state to be piloted so that you can, it's not really to prove their ability, but it's to establish the design parameters that we as engineers can use for those treatment technologies. So that'll be starting fairly soon. And then, of course, the normal design, construction, startup type sequence. So with that, that's quite a bit of information. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have and have some discussion.
Go ahead.
With the Concho River project, you have 7.5 MGDs flatline until 2070. Will that increase by any chance with the increase of population with the city?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. We would anticipate that number will increase as the city grows. And so we made a conservative estimate on 2 fronts. One, the 7.5 is kind of the lower end, and it's what we feel, Ellen and I feel, is reliable day in and day out during a drought, and that's the critical time. You're actually producing on an average day closer to 9, 8.5 to 9. But let's go back to the drought situation where everybody's conserving water, everybody's really being careful with what they're using. We feel 7.5 is reliable day in and day out. But as the city grows, the permits would be obtained for that growth. So we would look for that as a potential into the future. That's a great question.
Allison, we had, I think it was for kind of a different approach, that bed and banks type project that we talked about a year ago or so. There was some discussion about that once before. My question was that we never really got far enough down the line to where those permits were.
I think what you're talking about is where we talked about the soil bank filtration.
Yeah, that's right.
So the bed and banks would have been required. So it was a part of this 24 projects that were detailed. And so we actually did look into that project. But
we never went so far as starting that permitting process.
No, we did
at that
not.
time. Yeah,
but same type of permitting.
Yeah, it would be basically the bed and banks would be the same permit. If you remember, riverbank filtration was one of the options we looked at, and quite frankly, when we got into the detail of it, it just didn't provide any additional bang for the dollars that it was going to cost.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So what kind of timeline would we be looking at as far as start to completion, to being able to use it?
That's always the challenge, which is also why council authorized the permitting to get started. In an ideal world, in which we probably don't live anymore, the permitting is a 2 to 3 year process. Likely, with permits of this nature, you're going to have challenges, and that could stretch that for a year, maybe 2 years. So we just don't know. The good news is, and what we reported to council, there is a process. We are within the correct corners of the process. We feel very comfortable that at the end of the day, you obtain the permits. It's just a process to go through that. So early out, 2 years, could be 4 to 5. We're going to meet with the state and kind of get into that now and see what we can do.
So there's no, like with the TCEQ, no expedited, if we get in a serious situation, drought-wise, is there any kind of expedited permitting?
Unfortunately, no, in this particular case. So we're going to continue to work with Allison and staff on contingency plans. The good news is that the 31 months, the 25 months have kind of been consistent now for a year, several years. So staff does a great job, and CRMWD does the same thing. They take a very conservative approach and assume no inflow. Well, there's never been a year on record yet that there hasn't been inflow. So we're sensitive to the 31 months for sure. But we also kind of hope that we can move that out. But the board needs to be comfortable that staff is also looking at the what if. So if Ivy is offline for some short period of time before something else can be implemented, how do we bridge that gap? And we're working with them on that.
I see.
Wouldn't Hickory provide some additional, we've got some additional.
Right, so we are
Hickories.
proceeding with the Hickory project
Right.
and the expansion of it, but right now, since it can only pump and treat the 8 million
That's the-
gallons,
yeah.
that's why it's not
Limiting
in a
factor.
full calculation of that nature.
I think that was one of the main goals of this board, was to finish the Hickory first, so.
And we are,
Anything it will
and
be.
that's, outside of this, it is proceeding with that. So
We're
we are
gonna
kind of
be-
keeping the Hickory moving forward. It doesn't change with anything that we do with this project.
Timetable, what are we looking at Hickory-wise before we, I know we gotta drill the extra wells and upgrade the ion exchange plant.
I think that we'll be bringing something to council towards the end of this year relative to the cost and implementation of those and what we need to do to finish that out.
But what you're saying too, though, is there's still a processing capacity issue once it's,
I guess
mean-
we can pump and treat the 8 million gallons,
Right.
and we want to, we could probably bring more in at that time, but we only have the ability to treat the 8
That's what I
million
meant,
gallons.
yeah.
Yes, sir.
But when upgraded, we can treat the
Yeah.
the 12.
Yeah.
So I
Correct.
mean,
Yeah.
realistically, if everything else went dry, we could still function as a city on 12 million gallons a day. Now, we may not have car washes, but we would have municipal use. We might be in a
Right. We could-
high drought stage, but
Right, but I guess the other part of that is it's a single pipeline coming into the city. There's always downtime, maintenance, those type of things that occur. So it'd have to be 100% reliable all the time. And so, as we know, most of us being in this industry, that things aren't reliable 100% of the time. So that is another, but it will, yes, for the most part, day in, day out, we could survive off 12 million gallons.
and y'all dealt with that last week. You know what it takes to take a big hit on a pipeline. Y'all did a great job.
That's
So
a
I think
perfect
we're all proud
example of what happens right
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
Just a couple of other things. I agree with all of you, Scott. I think the Concho River augmentation is the most feasible, probably the smartest. You also give it a little bit of environmental buffer after you treat it. The one thing I will add to that is probably maybe some of you don't understand is we've got a Spence water supply that's got 67,000 acre feet of water in it now. We've got a pipeline that is not usable. We did a regional water plan a few years ago, and the study showed that for $25 million, we could slip line that pipeline, fix the pipeline, put a booster station on top of the hill to get it to here. I don't know if you realize, but you're entitled to 3,000 acre feet a year of Spence water, and you can bank 6,000. So in any 1 year, we could, let's just say Ivy was dry, Twin Buttes is dry, but Spence had water. We could pump up to 9,000 acre feet of water from that. So I think that is certainly a consideration. I think there's some other water supplies, groundwater supplies out east that have that potential as well, but we won't go into that right now.
Mr. Brown, that's a great point, and in the Spence rehab, that pipeline is a part of our final study. You hit all the correct points on that there is water. It's not a lot, but when you're out of water, any water is good. And I think that's one of those things that the city always has available, if you will, and certainly slip lining or even if you started with a new pipeline to do that can be done relatively quickly if that decision were made. So the fact that the city has that supply out of Spence is certainly not been lost on us, and is something that we did look at.
Where are we on, as far as, we implemented the plan, the rate structure, we redid all of that, and the cost element of this, how this came out? It's just been a while since we've looked at that comprehensively. I know, Scott, you're showing the cost effectiveness of that, but how does this fit into kind of our longer range plan from a financial perspective of this?
So in 2019 will be the start of the 4th year into that 5-year rate
Right.
plan. There was the $136 million put in that plan. A part of that does go against the wastewater debt and water debt. So this project would be similar in that nature, that there is wastewater plant components
Upgrade.
to this. So you'd obviously issue debt against the wastewater fund and the water fund. And so we are going to be looking into that more thoroughly, but the 121 is still within that 136. So we're just in different years of that implementation and looking at issuing debt, but we are going to look at that more thoroughly here pretty soon.
And that's tracking as we
Yes.
most recently as has
Yes,
been planned.
the fund balance is what we're looking at in terms of it's tracking, getting closer to that 75 days of cash on hand, if not greater.
Couple more questions. Scott, one more anyway. You talk about the low and high demand municipal and it comes through the Region F. I'm on the Region F board, and I'm not aware of a low and high demand. There's a one estimate figure based upon decade.
Right, Mr. Brown, you're correct. So my high demand, that line that I showed you at that dash line that you see would be the Region F line.
The dash line's the Region F line.
Dash line would be Region F.
And the solid low demand line, what would?
That is my calculation based on a smaller gallons per capita per day.
Gotcha.
And basically what I did there, Mr. Brown, is I worked with the staff to identify what their GPCD truly is when you're not in a drought condition, and then I added a 20% reserve capacity in there because you're a city. You can't plan on being at that razor edge when you're there. So it's their current gallon per capita per day, which Allison helped me, I think is 110, and then a 20% reserve on that. So in real rough numbers, that's using 130 gallons per capita per day, where I think Region F is 153 in that neighborhood. But that's the difference.
Okay. Thank you.
Couple of questions just to clarify. You did say in your capital estimation that it included that $7.5 million to update the water treatment plant. Did I hear you correctly about that?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, all right. Is this type process currently existing in Texas? Seems like a relatively simple type.
It is. It's used day in and day out. That's the nice thing about changing the concept of direct potable reuse to allowing us to use, Mother Nature is more of a buffer. It allows us to go back to much more normal treatment equipment and processes that are used around the state on a daily basis.
I guess the last question, is there anything involved in this that would make the adjoining landowners along that river have any concerns?
A great question, but there should not be. And so think of it from the perspective of what has the river seen. The river has never seen this water being discharged into it. So from that standpoint, and that actually helps in our permitting, had you been discharging prior to that and the river and downstream users had become accustomed to the water you were providing, that's a different story than going to them and permitting a source that the environment has never seen, and that actually helps us out. Good question.
Actually, I believe it was in the early to mid-90s, the wastewater treatment plant was upgraded to put it into the detention ponds. Before it was flood irrigated across the city farm. It went down into the gravel. It's pretty gravelous substrate, went down and it went into the river. So theoretically, although it wasn't a direct discharge, it was still being added to the flow of the Concho River.
So we've already been in the bank filtration business before.
Yes, sir.
And we actually looked at that. That would be more along the lines of infiltration. But we actually looked at that as a strategy and just did not feel that we could get the yield out of it. It is true. It is happening. But we just didn't feel we could capture as much of it as we would like to capture.
Anyone else? Mr. Hibbs, thank you very much.
bet.
It was a
Thank
very
you
good
for your time.
presentation.
You bet.
Do we have any public comment? If you would please state your name, please.
My name is Steve Williams. I live west El Dorado, and also would like to speak in behalf. My wife and I own a home in San Angelo also. And I would like to think that it's quote that I think there's some deficiencies in Mr. Hibbs' study. And my main goal is, we've been through this over and over. The water district in Slacker County was initially formed in the 60s because San Angelo was looking at our water, and they actually drilled some test wells in the South Concho Draw. And what they learned in a short period of time, they were just pumping it on the ground to test the wells. Well, Bodark Springs quit flowing, which is the South Concho River. I think that needs to be restated because, and then, Will Wilde, when he was there maybe 15, 20 years ago, he met with the board down there, and, they were looking at, San Angelo's looking at water. We got really good water, and it's really already your water, but it's also Menard's water. It's also Sonora's water, because we're on a divide out there. We're 600 to 800 feet higher than y'all. And the water that flows in there flows out of the end of the springs. It forms, four different rivers: Dove Creek, South Concho, San Saba, and the Devil's River. And basically that's where it all goes in. And what you have to realize is that when the water table goes down out there, your spring flow falls. Caroline Runge probably wants to talk to you, but they're painfully aware of that, what happened when we do a little excess pumping in our county and what it does to their spring flow. Past that, I would also like to speak as a San Angelo landowner. When we bought our house up here, the first thing I did, because San Angelo's always got water problems, is I brought a rototiller in there and I took all the dirt out of the yard and put gravel in the front yard, and we have a little bitty yard in the back that we water, and the rest of it's covered with landscaping, low water usage stuff. And I think this is another thing that I think is really deficient in Mr. Hibbs' study, is San Angelo could save a lot of water. Nobody up here drinks this water. They got other sources of water. They buy bottled water. We got decent water at home. We haul water from home, from El Dorado. But most people buy water. They don't drink it, and it goes to landscaping. It goes to yards and trees. But I really think you need to. City Council may not like it, but this group right here needs to go to Santa Fe to one of their water conferences, talk to their planning people out there, because I've been watching that because I have a nephew lives out there. And they've continued to cut their water use, I mean, it's a necessity for them. And they landscape with something besides grass. And I just think it's an enormous thing to cut water use down in the city. And y'all have the process through abatements or tax, whatever. You know, also realize you have the problem, you gotta sell water to pay for all this stuff you were just talking about. You know, you got a double-edged sword there. But somewhere in there needs to be, if you could use less water, you probably have plenty of water. And I think the problem we have out there too, back to El Dorado, I'm painfully aware, I'm on the west side. I know what happens when you're in dry times. And before I'm right against the University of Texas out there. And what happens to our water levels when they start pumping for fracking? You know, it didn't last very long because the oil field didn't work. They moved west, but it drastically affects our water. And it's, you know, Slacker County was one of the last counties in Texas that was incorporated as a county. And it's because they didn't have any water. There's no natural water out there. There's no springs. You know, we have Pelaya Lakes, and El Dorado, it's their only source of water. You know, if when our spring flows slow down, well, Sutton, Menard, Mertzen, everybody suffers because of the spring flows in their aquifers. Their aquifer levels drop. Anyway, that's about all I have to say, and I just hope you take some of that into consideration in your planning.
Thank you.
Mr. Williams, thank you. I might make a comment right quick that I agree with you on the plateau and the using the Edwards Trinity water. I think the city realizes that too, that cost per acre foot for the amount of water you're going to get is not worth it. Another thing you need to consider, not only your people in that area and not having the groundwater, but also the head of the river ranch in the South Concho Springs. That's what keeps that stream flowing. And truthfully, that's really the only perennial flow that we have anymore. We've got Spring and Dove in the North Concho that have become intermittent. The South Concho, however, still does flow, and that could certainly put a strain on the South Concho River, which is a municipal supply for the city. So I think
you know, I'm no hydrologist, but I know what our aquifer looks like. If you go into the Caverns of Snort's, perfect example. You know, if you drive through these cuts that the highway made, there's little old fractured layers. They may be this thick, they may be that thick. But those fractured layers in that solid rock is what moves the groundwater laterally into caves. And then those caves are what flow toward the springs. And there's not an ocean of water down there. And I think anytime somebody goes to pumping that 24/7, you're going to see some drastic things happen. You know, we got irrigation wells out there, but those guys irrigate 3 months out of the year. You know, they're trying to raise a crop and they quit, and we don't have a lot of it either. That aquifer has never been really tested on what it will produce. And I think you're going to have an enormous depression if you drill a bunch of wells in an area. You're going to keep people from watering their livestock or houses or maybe even the city.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Can you hear me? My name is Caroline Runge. I'm the manager of the Menard County Water Control and Improvement District and consulting manager to the Underground District. And my husband and I are ranchers in Slacker County along the South Concho Draw. I've given you a handout. I think you've already decided that a supply from the Edwards Trinity is not a viable option, but I want to heap a little bit more on that. If you look at that first page in the handout, that's the map of the watershed of the South Concho River, and as you see, 2/3 of it is in Schleicher County, in the northern and eastern part of Schleicher County. And if you turn over to the next page, that orange line describes the catchment basin for the major springs on the San Saba River for Menard County. And we'll get more into that, but Menard County depends 100% on the San Saba for its municipal use and 90% on the San Saba for its agricultural use. So with something like 3/4 of the catchment basin being in Schleicher County, it extends over past El Dorado. So really the whole eastern part of Schleicher County north of El Dorado is important to us, and even south of El Dorado is important to us. The next picture shows, you know, what's been happening with the springs over the last 50 years. The record for the government springs at Fort McCavitt, which are the headwaters of the San Saba River. So the record starts in 1958. And in this demonstration goes through 2014, and then the red line is the spring flow at Clear Creek, which is the largest major tributary of the San Saba, which goes into the river just above Menard. And what's interesting about this is that we used to have a great deal of spring flow. I'll get into this in a few minutes, but all over the entire Upper Colorado, flows have been diminishing in the main stem and in the tributaries to the Upper Colorado. And we've certainly seen that pattern with ours, but it's been exacerbated in the last 8 years by increases in groundwater permits in eastern Schleicher County. And for most of the period of record, the spring flows at McCavitt were greater than the spring flows at Clear Creek. In about 2011, a groundwater permit was increased by only 100 to 150 acre feet in Middle Valley above the springs. And ever since then, the spring flows at McCavitt have been less than they've been at Clear Creek by a significant amount. In 2011, we thought we'd seen the lowest point when the spring flow was 5.8 CFS at Fort McCavitt. And then this year, we saw spring flow down at 4.5 CFS in July. So just a very, very small amount of groundwater pumping has significantly affected our spring flow. The next page, I'm sorry, it's in the copying, it didn't come out well. But the green lines to the left are the averages per decade of the spring flows, starting in the 50s. And the 50s were actually higher than the 60s because of the huge rains that we had at the end of the 50s. The 60s were the lowest we saw until 2010. And at 2010, the line on the right is the spring flows from 2010 through 2012. And it went down like the Titanic. And since 2011, we haven't seen the spring flows at Fort McCavitt in double digits except one quarter in 2016, and I imagine today. We went out on the 6th and looked at our monitor well at Fort McCavitt, and it had come up 6 inches in 2 days with all of the rainfall we had there. And I went down and looked at the springs, and they were flowing with just that 6-inch increase. The springs were flowing more than I'd ever seen them in the last 2 decades. So it makes a huge difference. The next page, number 7, shows the depletion in flows in several of the Upper Colorado rivers. I've marked the one at Cristoval and the one at Menard, and it's interesting to note that the highest flows in the river. This was a study that was done for the Colorado Lavaca Bay and Basin Environmental Flows Committee, which I serve on. And when we started doing the hydrology for determining the environmental flow triggers, we found that the flows had just drastically decreased. But what was interesting about it was that although the rainfall levels have been fairly steady over the study period, since the 50s, the flows have decreased dramatically. And for instance, at Menard, in the drought of 2011, the flows, in 1956, which was the worst year of the 50s, the flows were 50,327 for the year, acre feet. In 2011, which was the worst year ever, they were 9,479 acre feet. They were only 18% of what the flows had been during the drought of the 50s. And the next page is an excerpt from a study that LBG Guyton, now WSP, did of the recharge in the Edwards Trinity Aquifer. 2006 was the date that they did it for the Region F Water Planning Group. And they found that during average years, the recharge in Schleicher County is only 4,000 acre feet. And, your 4 million gallons a day is 4,400 acre feet. So basically, if you took out 4 million gallons a day from Schleicher County, you'd be using the entire recharge during an average year. And during the wet years, the two wet years, 92, 2004, 45% of the recharge for that period was in those 2 years. So occasionally we get wet years like we've just had this week, and so we will get good recharge. But fundamentally, if you all pump from Schleicher County, you basically will be depleting a water supply you now get for free in the South Concho. And I talked recently with Ryland Howard, who owns the head of the River Ranch, and he said that his springs were seriously impaired this spring. So as we say in West Texas, you'd be shooting yourself in the foot if you pumped out of Schleicher County. And then finally, the last page, there's very little storage in the aquifer in Schleicher and Menard County. You see that there's the saturated thickness is only 200 to 300 feet total, and it's very random. What Steve said about the configuration of the aquifer is absolutely true. In some places you get pretty good flows, in other places you get nothing. Currently, our groundwater logs coming in from Menard County are 2-to-1 in favor of dry holes. So anyway, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. Thank you.
No, may I comment? This reminds me of something in the early 90s when then our state rep, Robert Janelle, was trying to get funded through the legislature for the brush eradication control. And I read in an article at that point in time that he had stated that I believe his U.S. Corps of Engineers said in the late 30s, Tom Green County ranked third in the state in the number of free-flowing springs within the county. And of course, being raised in the Great Creek area, I knew that they had quite a few springs. And of course, at that point in time, they were trying to determine if the invasive species are what is affecting those natural flows of that. And I've just wondered, I don't know if anybody here remembers seeing that article, and I have not followed it up, but has anybody truly determined that has that much negative effect?
Yes, as a matter of fact, this study that I cited that the Colorado Lavaca Bay and Basin Committee did concluded that one of the major influences on the depletion in the springs is invasive brush, and we certainly see that in Menard County. If you drive down the watershed, as I do every morning, you can see that most of that mesquite there is less than 50 years old. In other words, we didn't have that back in the 50s, and that probably is one of the major reasons. So that study concluded that was a major factor in the depletion of the springs. And I'm sort of a spring junkie, so I remember what you said about that. So.
Well, I'm getting to the point where I have a longer perspective than the average folks, and it is amazing how a mesquite and obviously the cedar and pear, which can grow through concrete, it seems like, but it is amazing when you see deer hunting. There's tons of areas around Tom Green County that no one ever went deer hunting, and now I think nearly every corner could be leased. So it's amazing how it is.
Well, not to jump on that horse, but I agree with you. We're seeing that in Menard County. About 60% of all the landowners now are non-resident, and they buy the land for deer hunting, and they don't do anything about the brush, and that's adding to our problem. And I don't know, do they think deer eat mesquite? I mean, the deer need other vegetation besides mesquite too. But and in Schleicher, on our ranch in Schleicher County, the cedar is just a terrible problem. We knock it down as much as we can, but.
I might add, Judge, we did when Representative Janelle started the brush program, it's now the Water Supply Enhancement Program, but when it was originally started as a brush control program, the North Concho River was the pilot project, the North Concho Watershed, which is about 1 million acres. And we did a 10-year study. We had 2 paired watershed sites of mesquite, and what we did was for 5 years we analyzed both of them, looked at the evapotranspiration, and then we sprayed on 200-acre plot. And based upon those 5 years, we noticed what we did was we did a difference in water, overall water budget. And in looking at that, and based upon what the treated versus the non-treated areas, the water budget equated to about 20 to 24,000 gallons per acre per year, which doesn't seem like a lot. But now if you put that across a 1 million acre watershed,
yeah.
What we saw that, and this is all theoretical, but if you killed 100% of the brush on the North Concho watershed, you would increase the water by 35,000 acre feet a year. Now, not all of that is going to be surface water flow down the North Concho River, but you're going to reinvigorate springs and stuff like that, to where when it does rain, you're going to have a quicker recharge and better recharge rates. So you're correct. And I might add, Carolyn, we've got the brush. We know we're all getting eaten up by the brush. We have a population increase, which more people are using the water. And also, we've got to also understand that the drought of 2011, 12, 13 is now the new drought of record. And we still haven't recovered from that. We're making some gains this month anyway. I think we'll see some recharge and the aquifers rise. But we have not overcome that last hot spell that we had when everything went so dry, and we were in trouble. And as a result of that, you can talk to Allison with the city, and you can also talk to CRMWD. Their water sales, their consumption amount by their users dropped by about 25% because of that. So as it's starting to trickle back up, there's still people of a newer generation are starting to think that, man, conservation is a critical key to all of this.
And that's what we needed, was a newer generation to have that experience, because the ones who went through the 50s had kind of gotten long in the tooth, the newer ones. So, but you're right, and I've read that study, every word of it, and have quoted it in our district management plan, because we feel that brush control is extremely important. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more public comment? Come on up.
My name is Alan Lange, and I do, so far until Friday, manage the Lipan Water District. Chuck mentioned a while ago about the flow of the river. I remember in the early 90s when the cities, I guess all the pipeline in their wastewater kind of collapsed along the river. And all that water, I took videos of it because we were having a big fight because of the water overflowing the pipelines and then flowing into the gravels all along the river. And but then since then the city's got it all fixed, so it's fine. But But I also have, used to fish the river down below 380, 380 over there. And, you know, we stopped fishing because the growths that you had on all the fish coming from the wastewater that was going into the river. And we would float and go up river, and you'd hear that water coming out from the banks, as he was saying, and it hit that rock layer, and it was just, you could smell it. It was just almost pure sewage, probably, close to it. And so my question, I guess, is how will this affect the ecology, the fisheries and stuff by running the wastewater down through the river? That's dealing with the ecology of it. But then the other question is how will this affect the farmers that are drawing water out of it right now as far as irrigating? You know, I'm not sure what their adjudication dates are or any of those kind of things, you know, and I was just kind of curious on how all that would work because right now I think they're all getting it through the canal system, so that's fine. It's moving it away from the river and getting it so where it's not that saturated area. But that's just some things that I've observed over the years.
I think Allison would be best.
Can
Can you answer those?
Yes, I'll let Ellen answer the first question. But in regards to the irrigation district contract, it is something that we'll be discussing with council. And as Scott mentioned earlier in the presentation, in times where we don't need it, we would hope that we could continue to send effluent water to the irrigation district. But in times of drought, we would proceed with bringing it into town in that 7.5 million gallons a day through the treatment plant. But the treatment components that we would add at the water treatment plant would be able to treat IV, concho. So it's not that that treatment plant at the water treatment plant can only treat this water. It could treat other waters that we may be using at that time and still be able to send our effluent.
And some of the other irrigation water, groundwater. I mean, the plant right now I don't think can treat as much of that, but it would be able to.
I guess, I'm sorry, I don't understand
well,
your question.
there is a lot of water. You know, we're talking about groundwater in other areas, and there is some water in some areas of the aquifers out east of town that would be available if you can get the landowners to sell it. But under state standards, it's not a potable. I guess it's more for irrigation. It's more than 3,000 parts per million of TDS. And so consequently, you don't have the ability, I don't think, at this point to...
No, we don't have the ability to treat that water.
Yeah, you need to get the plant fixed to do that.
Yes, but I don't think we would be looking at treating that water as a part of this project.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ellen.
Ellen?
I'll answer your first question about the quality of the discharge. This is a very different situation than the one that was described, in that we're going to be providing some advanced treatment at the wastewater plant. We'll be upgrading the wastewater plant to provide a very high quality water that's discharged to the river. And quite frankly, I think it'll improve the quality of the water in the river when it's discharged. But this is a process that happens all over the state with the Clean Water Act and the water quality standards that are in place that are enforced by the TCEQ. They are put in place to protect aquatic life, to protect the uses of the river. And so the quality that we'll be providing is very different than what used to go in the river under the previous process.
Very good, thank you. Do I have anyone else? All right, I guess we will, do we have any future agenda items we would like to discuss on the next board meeting?
May I make one comment in perspective? Just to kind of, we think about how fortunate maybe we do have it here. Happened to be out in Studi Butte, Terlingua area a couple of weeks ago. Their water system's at $9.50 a thousand, and they can't drink it. So it puts it in perspective. Parts of us were pretty blessed around here to have some decent water, and even though there are some complaints about it, it can be consumed and potable. So anyway, I just thought I'd bring that perspective. I found pretty shocking, which is basically double our rate, isn't it?
And so in some rates, that'd be triple.
I might just add, I know Allison posted some of the lake level updates, and I've been on it pretty solid this whole weekend. I might also just add that Oak Creek gained an additional 4.5 vertical feet of water, an additional 8,500 acre feet. So Oak Creek has really jumped up over the last 3 or 4 weeks. It's doubled its size. It's gained about, I think, almost 18,000 acre feet. And Spence came up another 1.5 feet, so it's got another 5,500 acre feet of water in it. But other than that, Allison was spot on with all of her other elevation increases and contents.
Very good. Well, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Second. All right, we're done. Thank y'all for coming.